S.T.A.L.K.E.R series is one of the most polarizing game series, perhaps of all time. When you talk to people about it, they either seem to love or hate it, and I know in my experience with playing it that I'm always at a similar impasse. Developed by GSC Game World, it's a game with all manner of technical issues and glitches that undermine what could have been a much greater experience, but it still does have one of the most palpable game worlds ever crafted and an absolutely killer atmosphere. If you can look past some glaring and irritating bugs, this is a fascinating game.
I said come in, don't stand there.
So the first game in this series is S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chernobyl, and it was released in 2007 for Microsoft Windows. I can remember working at EB Games at the time and being absolutely hyped for its release. I even bought the limited edition that came in a little metal tin. But was it a good game? Well, that's a good question, and I'm so glad you asked. So let's just find out, shall we? Story-wise, this is definitely an interesting premise. Taking place in Chernobyl after the 1986 nuclear disaster, you take on the role of a stalker with amnesia, known as the Marked One, hunting down another stalker named S.T.A.L.K.E.R for reasons I won't divulge. Now, stalkers are basically scavengers and hunters heading into the radiated areas of Chernobyl, referred to in-game as the Zone, looking for resources and supplies, though all most of them ever seem to do is sit around campfires and get into gunfights with bandits and mutants. The effects of the Chernobyl disaster can be seen in multiple ways, from the various anomalies throughout the game world like electrical storms and spots of radiation, through to the way various animals have been mutated and transformed into monsters. Graphically, it shows its age in certain ways. Some of the character models do look a bit dated, but the environments are still very impressive to look at. I love the way NPCs send out dynamic light with their flashlights, and the way that thunder visually affects your surroundings. Night and day cycle as you move through the environment, and all of the elements interact with one another in a way that's really impressive to behold. You know, you might see a group of bandits fighting the military, for instance, or suddenly find yourself hunted down by a pack of wild dogs. There was a moment where I was in a gunfight with the military during a heavy thunderstorm, and to say it was atmospheric as hell is a total understatement. What happens during these moments almost seems scripted, but when you try them again on a separate playthrough, it always plays out in an entirely different way. Life in the zone goes on, whether or not you're around to witness it, and it can be common to come back to an area and find the inhabitants inexplicably dead, which can be irritating if that was somewhere that you needed to hand a quest in, but I'll touch on that later in the review. Now, S.T.A.L.K.E.R has some great atmospheric sections, most notably the various abandoned underground areas like laboratories and tunnels. This is also where you encounter the game's more frightening enemies, and where gunfights become a lot more chaotic. It almost feels like an urban exploration simulator at times as you're exploring abandoned areas like warehouses and buildings. It's also where you'll find the best artifacts, which are equipable items with passive abilities like increased endurance or resistance to damage types. The only ones that I found all that useful were the ones that increased your health and endurance, meaning I could take a lot more damage and pretty much sprint around the place constantly, which is handy because you're going to be doing a lot of running around in this game. Keeping yourself alive boils down to managing all manner of items and equipment you come across in the game world, from the dozens of different weapons, all complete with multiple ammo types. You've got food and drink to stay nourished, and bandages and medkits to keep you on your feet in combat. You'll also need anti-radiation medicine in certain areas as well, so a fair bit of inventory management is needed. You've got a 50 kilogram weight limit for items, and once you go over it, your endurance drops down real fast. On top of that, all the armor you wear will offer up protection against all manner of damage types like electrical, fire, etc. It's a lot to contend with. The shooting has something of a tactical feel, using iron sights and a recoil system with an older, fixed health bar approach. Most of the shooting takes place against other humans, usually soldiers or bandits, who generally prefer to fire at you from a distance, still being able to hit you effortlessly with the game's crappiest weapons, whilst your bullets magically dance around their heads. Speaking of crappy weapons, it should be mentioned that the earlier missions are piss poor, and the game is quite difficult early on because of it. Later on, you get scoped weapons and better ammunition types, which can take out most enemies with a well-placed headshot, but the combat can still be very hit and miss, no pun intended. You often hear people joking about how you have to quick save after every single enemy you kill in this game, and the reason for that is that death is pretty much instantaneous, especially in close to medium range gunfights. If you see a nearby enemy and they've started opening fire, often it's too late. Interior areas are even more problematic, as the AI has a habit of sitting in a corner and not making any noise, waiting for you to walk in so they can just shoot you in the back. In opened up areas, you're often up against half a dozen enemies at once, and you're something of a sitting duck, made worse by the fact that crouching barely does a goddamn thing, so you're very limited in terms of what cover you've got. Fighting the mutants is even more irritating as you empty an entire magazine into their face at point blank range, and yet they still keep coming. As I mentioned earlier, there's all manner of side missions you can complete for various NPCs you encounter throughout the game world, all who work for different factions, and pretty much all of them just involve going to a certain place, killing or collecting something before just trekking back and turning it in. That's if the NPC hasn't been killed in your absence. There are dozens and dozens of these side missions, and this should be a good thing overall. I mean, the game world is extremely large, but the issue is that the maps are split up into smaller areas, and quests aren't often streamlined. For instance, someone might give you 4 different side missions, but these missions will literally take place on opposite sides of the game world, and they've often got time limits. You know how in other games, say like, Borderlands, NPCs will give you a series of missions that generally take place in the same vicinity? Well, that doesn't happen in S.T.A.L.K.E.R, and it can be a real pain in the ass. Considering the reward for these missions is usually just extra cash, something you really do not need, there's very little incentive to complete them. S.T.A.L.K.E.R also has some pretty big technical issues, from the glitches and bugs I just spoke about, but also general performance problems. Loading times are just horrendous. Yes, horrendous. Without tweaking anything, the load times will take anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes every single time you enter a new area, and roughly 1 or 2 minutes every time you die and have to quick load. Now, I was able to fix this by editing my registry. Apparently Steam was causing problems with the game or something like that, but even with this fix, there's still lots of stuttering in game when you're entering new areas, as the game kinda loads in all the new content. There's a few other general things that piss me off, like how certain ammo types are practically non-existent. I'm really not a fan of the map system either, which is just criminally unhelpful at telling you where the hell you are. And also, certain enemy types are just way too overpowered and can take an absolute pounding before dying. But this is really what playing S.T.A.L.K.E.R is all about, these kind of half-baked game mechanics and technical issues that are going to confront and irritate you almost constantly. And your enjoyment from the game overall is going to boil down to whether or not you can look past it all and tolerate it on the whole. And I don't care about the mods that can supposedly fix this stuff. I mean, there's a huge argument about whether or not these mods fix the game for better or worse. But the base game is definitely flawed, and that's something you can't argue with. On that note, S.T.A.L.K.E.R is really one of those love it or hate it type of games, and I think everyone who plays it is really going to react in a different way. I mean, the game has 6 endings, for instance. The first time I played S.T.A.L.K.E.R, I absolutely hated it. The second time I played it, I hated it again, but the third time, I think it finally clicked. Is it for everyone? I don't know. What's better, pants or shirts? Left or right, up or down? No one can answer that. And I think I'd have an even amount of backlash whether I congratulate or condemned it. But I guarantee you've not played anything quite like it, and for that alone, it's probably worth checking out. Turn off the crosshair, crank the difficulty up, and get immersed, but just be aware that this is not going to be a smooth ride. Expect turbulence.
Get out of here, S.T.A.L.K.E.R.